I never thought my childhood home held secrets that could haunt me, but that night changed everything. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where the echoes of the past seemed to linger in every corner. My parents bought the old Victorian house when I was a kid, and while most of my friends found it charming, I always sensed something was off. It wasn't just the peeling wallpaper or the strange creaks in the floor. It was the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my sight. Years later, I returned home to help my father care for my ailing mother. The house felt different, as if it had become a living entity, breathing in sync with its surroundings. The air was thick with a musty smell mixed with something metallic, like blood. As I walked through familiar halls, echoes of my childhood laughter twisted into faint whispers that crawled under my skin. One evening, I decided to explore the attic, a place I had always been warned to avoid. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. As I climbed, the musty scent grew stronger, and a chill wrapped around me like a wet blanket. The attic was cluttered with forgotten relics, old toys, dusty boxes, and yellowed photographs. It felt like a mausoleum of memories, each item holding a buried story. I found an old, ornate mirror, its surface clouded with age. As I wiped it clean with my sleeve, I felt an odd sensation, as if the glass pulsed under my fingers. The reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. It wasn't just my image. There was a flicker, something shadowy darting behind me. I whipped around, but the attic was empty. My heart raced, and I could hear a faint rustle in the far corner as if something had been disturbed. Turning back to the mirror, I gasped. My reflection was distorted, almost melting. The edges of my face blurred, and from the depths of the glass, a figure began to emerge. A grotesque, shadowy version of myself, its mouth stretched in a grin that was not my own. I stumbled backward, breathless. As I fell, the mirror shattered, sending icy shards flying across the floor. I scrambled to my feet, the jagged pieces glinting ominously in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, echoing around me, a cacophony of tortured voices. "Help us!" they pleaded, merging into a symphony of despair that reverberated through my bones. I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath against my neck, and I froze, paralyzed by a fear I had never known. In a moment of panic, I dashed for the attic door, the whispers intensifying, clawing at my mind. I flung it open and stumbled down the staircase, nearly tripping over my own feet. As I reached the bottom, I heard glass crunching beneath me and glanced back at the attic. The mirror was gone. In its place stood a dark void, an emptiness that beckoned. I ran through the house, my pulse pounding in my ears. The walls seemed to close in, shadows stretching and twisting as if alive. I could hear my parents' voices faintly calling my name, distorted and echoing as if trapped in another dimension. I burst into the living room where my mother sat, her eyes wide and glassy. She murmured, "The voices! They want to come home!" A surge of nausea hit me, the air thickening with dread. My father was nowhere to be seen. I rushed to the front door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, wrapping around me like chains, pulling me back into the suffocating darkness of the house. I turned to my mother, her face now a mask of horror. As she pointed toward the hallway, she whispered, "You have to stop it, before it's too late." Footsteps echoed from the shadows, slow and deliberate. I felt bile rise in my throat as I turned back to the hallway where a figure emerged from the gloom. It looked like my father, but his features were warped, exaggerated as if smeared with darkness. I could barely recognize him, his eyes hollow and devoid of humanity. "Come here," he beckoned, his voice a low growl that reverberated through the air. With every ounce of strength, I pushed against the door, panic flooding my veins. It finally gave way, and I stumbled outside into the cool night air. I looked back at the house, its windows dark like soulless eyes watching me. The whispers faded into the night, leaving an unsettling silence. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my pulse racing like a drum in my chest. As I sat behind the wheel, trembling, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the attic window, a figure stood, its features blurred and shifting, but I knew it was waiting for me. The night air felt heavy, and the lingering scent of decay clawed at my throat. I could still hear the whispers in my mind, echoing the warning, "You can never really leave." I never believed in ghosts
until I found myself staring into the lifeless eyes of one. It started when I moved to a quaint little town in Vermont, where autumn leaves whispered secrets as they fell. I was a newcomer, a struggling artist seeking inspiration, and the old Victorian house I rented sat at the end of a winding, overgrown path. Its charm was intoxicating, but the deeper I settled into my new life, the more I felt the weight of something invisible pressing down on me. The first few nights were peaceful, filled with the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a suffocating silence draped over the house. One night, while painting in my dimly lit studio, I heard a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against the window pane. I paused, my paintbrush hovering above the canvas, goosebumps prickling my skin. I glanced toward the window, but the night was a heavy blanket of darkness, concealing whatever lay outside. Days turned into weeks, and the tapping became a troubling routine. It began as an occasional interruption during my work, morphing into a rhythmic insistence that grew louder each night. At first, I attributed it to the wind or the settling of the old house, but something inside me stirred with dread. I started to avoid the studio after sunset, retreating to my small bedroom where I could drown the sounds in the comfort of my blankets. Yet the feeling of being watched never left me. One evening, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. Armed with a flashlight and shaky resolve, I crept down the creaky staircase, the floorboards groaning under my weight. As I reached the narrow hallway, the air thickened and the scratching intensified, now a frantic clawing like something desperate to escape. I felt a chill wrap around me, clinging to my bones. My heart raced as I approached the source of the noise, a door at the end of the hall, long sealed and draped in dust. With trembling hands, I turned the doorknob, the rusted metal cold against my skin. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The musty smell hit me like a wave, a blend of decay and something sweetly rotten. I shone the flashlight inside, illuminating the walls covered in old newspaper clippings detailing disappearances and gruesome events that had taken place in the very town I called home. My breath quickened as I scanned the articles, each one more horrifying than the last. Suddenly, a soft whimper echoed through the room. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound seemed to come from the far corner, where shadows danced in the flickering light. I stepped closer, each heartbeat thudding in my ears. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something hunched over, a figure cloaked in darkness. My stomach turned, nausea clawing at my insides. It was a child, or at least it looked like one, skin pale and stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken and hollow. "Help me," it rasped, a voice like gravel scraping against metal. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. It reached out a hand, fingers elongated and twisted, inviting, yet terrifying. The air thickened, a palpable tension wrapping around me, and I could feel my own breath hitching in my throat. Panic surged through me, awakening a primal instinct to flee. I turned to escape, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside with the wretched thing. I pounded on the wood, feeling panic rise like bile in my throat. The child's voice grew louder, more insistent. "Stay, stay with me." The walls seemed to close in, swallowing my cries for help. The scratching noise transformed into a cacophony of whispers, each one pulling me deeper into despair. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, icy and unyielding. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room began to swirl, the walls warping and bending as if alive. I stumbled backward, crashing into the corner, my heart racing as the whispers grew louder, a symphony of agony and yearning. The child was closer now, its face twisted in sorrow, tears streaming down its ghostly cheeks. "Please, don't leave me." I didn't know how long I stayed there, caught between the horror unfolding before me and the instinct to escape. When the door finally creaked open, I bolted, running through the hallway and up the staircase, not daring to look back. The house felt different now, like it knew I had seen something it was meant to hide. I slammed the bedroom door shut and sank to the floor, gasping for breath. But the sounds didn't stop. They followed me, echoing in my mind, the whispers weaving into my thoughts. I could still hear the child pleading, beckoning me back. Days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and frantic attempts to paint, but the canvas remained blank, haunted by that wretched gaze. I was never alone again. The weight of the room pressed on my chest, a reminder that I had disturbed something that should have remained buried. As autumn turned to winter, I found myself staring out the window, watching the first snowfall blanket the ground. I thought of leaving, of escaping the house that had become a prison. But I also wondered, what if I could help it? The whispers grew softer, almost comforting now, wrapping around me like a familiar shroud. The cold crept in, but I felt a warmth pulsing from the darkness behind me. I turned to the hallway, the door ajar just enough to reveal a sliver of shadow. I could hear it again, the soft whimpering, a melody that tugged at my heart. I took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath me, and for the first time I felt the pull of the past enveloping me. I knew I would return to that room, to the child who had called out for help. The air shimmered, and I felt a sense of belonging I had never known before. As I approached the door, the whispers crescendoed, wrapping around me like the first blanket of snow. Soft, cold, and entirely consuming.
I never thought I'd find myself staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. The summer before my junior year of college, I took a job as a caretaker for an old house on the outskirts of town. It belonged to a reclusive woman who had passed away, leaving behind a legacy of rumors. Everyone in the small town whispered about her, and I soon learned that the house itself was part of those tales. They said it was haunted, but I dismissed the idea. I needed the money for school, and the pay was enough to overlook the house's gloomy reputation. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. It smelled of mildew and dust, thick enough to taste, and the flickering light bulbs made the shadows dance unsettlingly. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, dismissing it as paranoia from the isolation. But then, I found a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the living room. The leather was cracked, revealing yellowed pages filled with frenzied handwriting. My curiosity got the better of me, and I skimmed through the entries, each one more disturbing than the last. The woman documented her descent into madness, describing strange noises at night and fleeting glimpses of a figure wandering the halls. She wrote about a smell of decay that wafted through the house even when no food had been left to rot. My heart raced as I read her words, feeling her fear seep into me. But I couldn't shake the nagging voice telling me it was just the ramblings of a lonely woman. I closed the journal and locked it away, hoping to forget what I'd read. The nights grew longer. I started hearing things, whispers echoing through the hallways, soft and unintelligible, like a distant conversation just beyond comprehension. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks on my mind, but the air felt thick with something unnameable. My dreams twisted into nightmares, filled with shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as I lay frozen in bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen, the smell hit me, a revolting stench that curled my stomach. It was as if something had died in the walls. I rummaged through cabinets, convinced there had to be some old food or maybe a dead rodent hidden away. But nothing could explain the overpowering odor. As I stepped back into the living room, I felt a chill wrap around me like a vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I turned, and for a brief moment, I caught sight of a figure standing in the corner, just beyond the light. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the darkness. My body froze, my mind racing with instinct to flee, but I couldn't move. The
The figure smiled, a grotesque grin twisting its features. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest as I searched the room for any hint of what I had just seen. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the house and the lingering scent of decay that now felt like it was seeping from the walls. That night, I lay wide awake, my skin crawling. Each creak of the house sent my senses spiraling, the whispers returning, louder now, echoing in a language I couldn't understand. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was all in my head. The next morning, I found another entry in the journal, dated just days before the woman had died. She spoke frantically of the figure, claiming it was calling her, promising safety and peace in exchange for something she couldn't grasp. My skin prickled as I read her words, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to leave, to flee from whatever had taken root in that house. But the rent was due, and I couldn't afford to abandon my responsibilities. Days passed, and my resolve weakened. I started losing track of time, the hours blending into a haze of confusion and dread. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony that filled my head, clawing at my sanity. I could feel the figure lurking just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. With each passing day, the stench intensified, invading my clothes, my hair, my skin, until I could hardly remember a time when I wasn't engulfed by it. My dreams turned to nightmares of darkness closing in, and I felt the inescapable pull of the house drawing me deeper into its clutches. One night, overwhelmed and desperate, I followed the whispers, letting them lead me through the darkened halls. They beckoned me to the basement, a place I had avoided since my first day. The air was thick with dampness, and as I descended the creaking stairs, the smell became suffocating. My heart raced as I turned on the light, revealing crumbling walls and piles of forgotten debris. It was there, in the corner, that I saw it again. The figure, now clearer, its smile stretching impossibly wide. In that moment, I understood. The whispers were not just sounds, they were words dripping with promises and lies. I felt an overwhelming urge to approach, to surrender to whatever it was that stood before me. My body moved as if pulled by invisible strings, and I was no longer in control. I took a step forward, breath quickening, losing myself in the darkness that enveloped me. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers faded, the figure vanished, and I found myself standing alone in the basement, the light flickering ominously. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, rushing up the stairs. But the house was no longer the same. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air heavy with a sense of finality. I reached the top, but the door was gone. I pressed against the wall, the reality shifting, and I was trapped, lost within the very thing that I had wished to escape. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and I felt the weight of countless eyes upon me, each one eager to witness my descent into madness. The stench, now palpable, surrounded me, suffocating and all-consuming. I closed my eyes, as if that could shield me from whatever nightmare awaited. And then, amidst the chaos, I heard her voice, a soft, haunting echo that promised peace, that promised everything I had ever desired. In that suffocating moment, I realized I had become part of the house, a whisper in its dark legacy, forever caught in its unending grasp. As the figure watched and smiled, waiting for the next to fall into its embrace.
It began with a whisper in the dark, a voice from the depths of my mind. I'm Sarah, a 28-year-old graphic designer in a small Ohio town where the streets are quiet and nights stretch longer than days. I always believed I had a firm grip on reality, but everything changed the night I discovered what truly lurked in the shadows of my home. The old Victorian house I rented was charming, filled with creaks and groans that made it feel alive. I often joked about it being haunted, yet deep down, I found comfort in the familiar sounds of settling walls. That changed one night when I heard it, a low murmur, almost like a hum, drifting through the halls. It was late, a typical evening with me sprawled on the couch, focused on my latest design project, when the air grew thick with something I couldn't quite grasp. Initially, I dismissed the noise, attributing it to old pipes or my imagination running wild after a long day. I had been living there for 3 months, and at first, I loved the solitude. My friends warned me about being alone too much, claiming it wasn't healthy, but I cherished the silence. I could hear the trees scraping against my window, their branches tapping like skeletal fingers. But that night, the tapping morphed into a rhythmic pattern, pulsing in sync with my heartbeat. A chill crept up my spine, and an icy dread washed over me. I shook it off, reminding myself I was being ridiculous. I turned on the TV to drown out the unsettling feeling. But as the screen flickered, the hum grew louder, rising like a tide that merged with the static. My breathing quickened, and I could taste fear's metallic tang on my tongue. Shadows in the corners twisted and elongated, dancing just out of sight. I grabbed my phone to call a friend, but the battery was dead. Panic bubbled in my chest as I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. I stood, resolved to confront whatever was making that noise. My bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, sending a shiver up my spine. The house felt different now, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I crept into the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. The sound was coming from the basement, a place I had avoided since moving in. I recalled the previous tenants' warning about a lingering presence down there, something they couldn't articulate. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs, each creak of the old wood echoing like a warning. The air grew stale at the bottom, smelling of damp earth and decay. The hum transformed into a low chant, almost melodic, wrapping around me like fog. I flicked on the light, revealing a cluttered space filled with boxes of forgotten memories and old furniture draped in dust. There was something else, a lingering presence that charged the air, like the calm before a storm. It scraped against my mind, urging me to leave, to return to my room's safety. But I couldn't turn back. I needed to know. I stepped further into the room, and as I did, the chanting faded, replaced by eerie silence. Abruptly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I could hear my breath, ragged and shallow, mingling with a distant sound. Something soft and wet. My heart raced, pounding in my throat. I fumbled for the wall, desperate for something solid, but my fingers brushed against something slick. I recoiled, nausea rising. I reached for my phone again, but it didn't illuminate. Instead, a cold breeze rushed past me, a whisper of despair gripping my heart. It pushed me back, urging me to flee, but I was frozen, caught in a web I couldn't see. The chanting returned, louder now, as if a crowd gathered around me, their voices twisting together in agonizing harmony. I stumbled back, my foot landing on something soft. I barely contained a scream as I lost my balance and fell. As I hit the ground, a heavy weight settled on my chest, pinning me down. I gasped for air, the darkness suffocating, and the chanting rose to a fever pitch. I felt it pressing in, igniting a terror I had never known. I closed my eyes, praying it would end, that I would wake up and find it was all a dream. But when I opened them, I saw the dim outline of a figure looming over me. Indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but its eyes, dark, endless pits, seemed to hold the weight of the world. I could hardly breathe as the figure leaned closer, its breath hot against my face, mingling with a putrid scent. It opened its mouth, but no sound emerged, only the throbbing chant that enveloped me. I felt reality crumbling, darkness closing in as the figure faded back into the shadows. And just like that, the chanting stopped. Silence engulfed me, thick and suffocating. I lay on the floor, trembling, too afraid to move. The weight of what had pressed on me lingered like a ghost. I crawled back to the stairs, climbing them with all my might, heart racing. Back in my room, I locked the door. The house's familiar sounds, now whispers of something ancient and terrible. But sleep eluded me. Instead, I lay wide-eyed in the dark, convinced whatever had visited wasn't finished. As hours passed, I could almost hear it waiting, lurking just beyond the thin veneer of my reality. There was no explanation, no comfort to be found, just deep, unsettling dread clinging to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers had only just begun.